welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
Doing fantastic today, Tim. We have a wonderful guest on. We're continuing the streak of really remarkable, talented true crime writers. And the upcoming guest is like the cream of the crop. But Tim, how are you today?
I am doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yes, I'm really excited to speak with Casey Sherman again. He is a local author, has written some amazing books. Some of them have been made into movies. So yeah, you're right when you say he is a big deal. And this book is called Helltown, the untold story of a serial killer on Cape Cod. And it's about the serial killer Tony Costa, and sort of one that's been lost to time, even to us here in Massachusetts. But Casey does a great job telling this story, as he always does, and he's also great to speak with in this interview.
And we know that you'll enjoy this conversation with Casey. He's so articulate and well-spoken, and he's coming from this from the right place. He really is talking about not the serial killer specifically, but he's bringing out all of his victims and just the vicious nature of the attacks and who these women were and what the community was like at that time.
So let us know what you think of this episode on social media. You can find us at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod.
And also, Tim, if people wanted to listen to this without the commercials, plus, every other episode of Crawlspace without the commercials and our other shows, where would they go?
Well, listeners can now subscribe to Crawlspace Premium on Apple Podcasts. You get ad-free episodes, early releases, and our weekly bonus show. And if you're not an Apple user, you can go to crawlspace.supportingcast.fm and find the same product there. And we are going to break for commercial real quick, and we'll be right back with author Casey Sherman. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast, author Casey Sherman. How are you today, Casey?
Hey, good, guys. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for coming back on to talk about your latest book in this really horrendous, terrifying case. The story is, again, terrifying, but I'm a little mad at you because the area where this takes place is like my happy place. My girlfriend and I go there at least once a year. It's one of those wonderful places that you can spend a weekend at, and now I have to connect it to your book, which is so well written that it made me upset that there was a time in this world where this place wasn't so happy, and there was these like dark things that happened there.
Sure. Cape Cod is still a beautiful place, so feel free. Enjoy the time down there with your girlfriend. But, I grew up on the Cape, guys. So I had heard about this story that took place in 1968, 1969 as a kid growing up in the middle of Cape Cod in Hyannis. And when I was a child, going out for trick-or-treat on Halloween, everybody would whisper, be aware of Tony Chop Chop, which was the moniker given to the serial killer in this case. So this case was really Cape Cod folklore for me growing up, and I didn't, rack focus on it. I didn't really take it seriously until the middle of the pandemic when my brother gave me a call. He said, look, pick me up on the Cape. Let's just take a ride together. And we drove from village to village, reminiscing about our childhoods, and then we end up on Commercial Street in Provincetown. And all of the storefronts were shuttered during the height of the pandemic. So we began to talk about the ghosts, real and imagined, in Provincetown, and we landed on the Tony Costa serial murder case from that time period because a lot of the different storefronts and in buildings that are really important to this investigation are still freestanding in Provincetown. And I remember after that day, I went back to my writing office here and I took a look at it for the first time. And I was shocked at how barbaric and destructive this case truly was.
And I'm not really mad at you. That was a joke. I would never.
I understand.
Shocked, barbaric, good words to use right there. It really is.
Yeah, as an investigative journalist, I've covered, 50 to 75 homicides, including Jack the Ripper. And quite frankly, I've never seen anything as brutal as what happened in Provincetown and Truro in 1969. And, going through the documentation on this case, I had access to thousands of court transcripts, investigative reports, and, really most important to me were the crime scene photos and the autopsy photos. And that's when this story really hit home, and I realized that it was probably darker than anything I've ever written about, before or since.
Is that because of the brutality of the crime scene photos?
That was because of the brutality of the crime scene photos, and with Helltown guys, I wanted to give the victims here, all young women, agency. I wanted to give them a voice, and it's really a cautionary tale of about trust and comfort with people. Tony Costa, the serial killer at the heart of Helltown, he's the real life version of Norman Bates from Psycho. An amateur taxidermist who obviously was murdering these young women, burying them in shallow graves. But he also had a bit of Charles Manson to him as well, where he was incredibly charismatic. He had, a lot of women and men surrounding him in Provincetown because he was this hippie-like messiah to a lot of people down there. And my way into the story, as you guys know, having read it, is not necessarily the murder case itself, but two journalists and writers who are, trying to gain access to the killer and gain access to the story. And those writers were Norman Mailer and Kurt Vonnegut.
Right, which is such a wonderful surprise when you have those parallel stories happening, which is something that I think both Tim and I love about reading a good true crime book, is when there's something happening concurrently with the actual crime that interested you in the first place. So, just knowing the Cape and knowing that this happened with Costa, I had no idea until I read your book that Vonnegut and Mailer had a hand in the coverage and had a voice in this. How was that for you when you came, you just saw the depth in which they went?
Yeah, to me it was really going down that writer's journey, that journey into the heart of darkness. And I look at Kurt and Norman. In 1969 they were basically polar opposites in their writing careers. Norman Mailer was a New York Times best-selling author since his first book, The Naked and the Dead, in the 1940s. So he was a larger-than-life character at the time, really taking the mantle from Hemingway after Hemingway committed suicide back in the early 1960s. He's got celebrity, he's got wealth. Kurt Vonnegut has none of that. Kurt Vonnegut is a struggling car salesman working and living in Barnstable. He's got a story in his head that it would ultimately be the epic Slaughterhouse-Five, but he's not there yet. And one of his daughters, one of his children, Edie, is a part of this hippie culture in Provincetown. So he, starts to focus on this case really because he's a concerned parent. And then he's got to put, his former journalistic skills, because Kurt had been a cub crime reporter in Chicago back in his early days. He had to put those to work to see if he could get the story. So following their trajectory, around this case and their journeys, while also, following the footsteps of Tony Costa, was a unique challenge for me as a writer.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you can, tell us a little bit about Costa, about his upbringing.
Sure. Costa was the son of a broken home. His mother was basically a single mom growing, while raising him. His father died during World War II. And I think, he had this real unique, bizarre relationship with his mother. It was a love-hate relationship that I think manifested itself later on when he started to target women, because I do think he had, almost a romantic idea of motherhood and what his mother could be. And when his mother remarried and took all her love away from him to spread it to her husband and Tony's stepbrother, or half-brother rather, he got angry and he got violent. And, his journey is incredibly twisted and bizarre. And one of the things I think, readers will take from Helltown is, I'm not just kind of creating a character in Tony Costa. Costa, likened himself as a writer, much like Norman Mailer and Kurt Vonnegut. So, after the crimes, Costa wrote a manuscript called Resurrection. It was an unpublished manuscript that he wrote in prison, where for the first time I can actually take the reader into these crime scenes. And I do so, through Costa and Costa's alter ego. Costa never, took responsibility for these murders. Instead, he placed it on a demon that was growing inside him, somebody that he called Corey Devereaux. And that is, the clinical diagnosis there is ego splitting. And that's what the, psychiatrist realized was going on in this man's very sick brain.
Yeah, you made the comparison to Norman Bates, and it's kind of remarkable how similar it is with the mother dependency and the ego splitting.
Taxidermy.
I mean, is this like, was he influenced by this?
I don't think he was influenced by Hitchcock, but there are a lot of, real parallels to their stories. I don't think Costa, tried to, create a character based on Norman Bates or Psycho. I think he was already living it at the time. It's just a really eerie and odd coincidence that Costa was the living embodiment of, what was at that time a fictional character.
And we've made some references to the culture that was going on at the time in Provincetown. Can you take us back there and just open that up a little bit? What was the area like at the time, and when did these victims start being connected?
Sure. And that's a great question, Lance, because, going over the case so many decades later, I was really startled that, when the young women began to disappear, nobody really cared. Because it was, Provincetown was a transient culture at the time. It was a hippie enclave, much like Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco or Greenwich Village. Young people came and went. Their own families didn't really raise concern when they went missing. The police certainly didn't care. There were, upwards to 400 missing young women in New England. From 1968 and 1969. And, the idea behind it was, at least from a law enforcement perspective, these are kids, they're on a caravan somewhere, they're traveling the country, they want to be free, so let's let them be free. So there was a period of time where young women were missing and being murdered in the most brutal ways possible, and nobody really knew about it. And here is Tony Costa hiding in plain sight.
And who were Costa's victims? And I guess what did that tell us about Costa?
Well, Costa's first victim was a young 19-year-old Eastham girl named Sydney Monson. And she was living in Provincetown at the time. She was very friendly with Tony Costa, as were all of these young women. He was, very comforting, very smart, very intelligent. There was really no fear that these women would have had around him. And he took that comfort level into his own hands, brought them to places, dark places like the woods of Truro. And he would stab them, shoot them, dismember their bodies, and bury them in shallow graves. So Sydney goes missing in the spring or early summer of 1968, followed by a young woman named Susan Perry, another Provincetown girl who, falls into Tony Costa's web. She goes missing later that fall. And it isn't until two young educators from Providence, Rhode Island, go on a midwinter break to Provincetown in January 1969 that this case blows up. Marianne Wysocki and Patricia Walsh. Those were their names. And these young women, one was a teacher, one was in college studying to be a teacher. And this was, when I wrote Helltown, guys, what I was really trying to paint a picture of was this canvas in this large landscape in which these murders take place. 1968, 1969 reminds me a bit of what we're going through today as a culture. In 1968, you had the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy, of Martin Luther King. The Summer of Love is a distant memory. You've got the bloody protests at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and you've got the Nixon inauguration. And these young women were, watching all of this unfold, as do all the characters in my book. And they just wanted to break away. They wanted to get away, as far away, at least for the weekend, as they could. And they decided to take their VW Beetle on a journey to Provincetown, off season, where they could quietly reconnect with each other and meet some like-minded people. And they enter a boarding house where Tony Costa just happens to be living at the time. And he brings them in. He's charming. He's offering them tips on where to go and what to see in Provincetown. Their defenses are dropped, and Tony starts to watch them, much like a hunter would watch their prey. And Tony was, we mentioned the fact that he was an amateur taxidermist, and he learned, the methods and techniques of taxidermy as well as hunting. And that's what he did with these women.
As we talk about his amateur taxidermy hobby, I'm wondering if that occupation should be maybe a red flag with some people.
I mean,
and I don't mean it to be a joke.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, if you walk into any lodge, in America or Europe, you're going to see those big stuffed heads on the wall. Now, that's not my thing. I'm not a hunter, but I understand that people, do enjoy that pastime with their families. And, a lot of them want, trophies of their hunts. I'm a big Hemingway guy. So, anytime you walk into the Hemingway house in Key West or in Cuba or anywhere else, you're going to see a lot of his kills. I think Tony Costa co-opted, that occupation or that activity, and used it, in a sick and twisted and, macabre way.
And I certainly don't want to offend any professional or amateur taxidermists out there. It's just a question that was sort of rattling around in my head, but well answered.
Yeah, and Costa had a manual. He had a book, and it's a book that he studied, much like he would study anything else. And he learned over time when he was a young man, living not on Cape Cod but in Somerville, Massachusetts. He started to, after his mother had remarried, he took out his anger and his frustration out on neighborhood pets. So, people were missing their poodles or their cats, and they were all being stuffed. And, Tony created a menagerie of animals that he kept under his bed, from 11 to 16. And when he was 16 years old, he elevated and graduated to assaulting a young girl. He should have gotten the help that he needed at that time, but his mother stepped in and pleaded with the judge, if you let him go, I will take him away from Somerville, someplace safe where he can start his life again, and I'll watch him. Well, she took him to Provincetown, and she didn't watch him. And, ultimately, a monster evolved and was created.
Gosh, yeah, I don't know. As a parent, I don't know what I would do about that, but that is such like a glaring red flag, at least in my head today. I don't know what should have been done about that, but I just can't imagine, sort of letting him off the hook. I have to imagine that sort of led him to feel invincible or something later in his life.
That's right. And, I think the people around him, they saw the red flags, especially his mother, Cecilia, and instead of getting him help or bringing him to the authorities, she did everything that she could to protect him, while, more young women went missing and were killed.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
We always hear about the most famous handful of serial killers, and Costa really doesn't fall into that conversation very often. Why is it that he's almost become, until reading Helltown, almost become an unknown serial killer.
Yeah, I mean, he really was an unknown serial killer before Helltown was published. But a lot of that has to do with the year in which it happened, 1969. So these murders, or at least the murders of the two women from Providence, Rhode Island, are investigated in January, February 1969. Costa is later captured, thank God. But several months later, Charles Manson starts to, order the murders of wealthy and famous people in Southern California, and it really kind of takes all the oxygen out of the room and takes all the focus from journalists. So Costa goes back into the background and darkness, while Manson is elevated as this iconic criminal figure. And Costa knew about that, and he talked about that, and he was very frustrated that somebody else was taking his headlines and the attention from what he was doing on Cape Cod. And it's interesting, there are a lot of similarities, as I mentioned, between Manson and Costa. And what I didn't learn until after the book was published, sat down with one of Tony Costa's, let's call it, family members. So like Manson had his family members, Costa again had his disciples. And this woman who's in her 60s or late 60s now, very pleasant woman, said that Costa and Charles Manson knew each other, because this woman had an apartment on McAllister Street in San Francisco in 1967. And that's where Costa lived with her, and Manson lived down the street. So they would attend social gatherings together, get high together, have parties together. And I don't think there was, probably any talk about, what their murderous lives would look like. But the fact that two, serial killer figures were sharing the same air and oxygen is really unique.
Yeah, that is wild and just disturbing to think of. So can you take us through how Costa got caught?
Well, Costa wasn't a very bright criminal. He thought he was smarter than the police detectives. And one of the police detectives, a state trooper from Massachusetts named Tom Gunnery, I spent a lot of time with him working on the book, researching the book, getting his perspective on it. And there was a cat and mouse game that went on for several weeks between Costa and the investigators. Once they leaned on him a little bit because of the connections that Costa had with the boarding house where the two women went missing, with Susan Perry and Cindy Monson. They were friends of his. So the investigators start to focus on him very quickly, but they did not have the evidence to bring him in. So there was a lot of back and forth between Costa and the cops that is very revealing in the book, until these investigators, stumble on these murder scenes. These women were buried in shallow graves in Truro, and it was horrific, because Costa was dismembering them and stacking them like cords of wood. So when one body is recovered, then the others start to get recovered. There was actually a hole where Costa had put the remains of two of his victims. And still, police didn't have enough evidence to tie him to the case until they found the murder weapons. And at that point, they brought Costa in. And that creates a very, sensational political story here in Massachusetts. The district attorney at the time, Ed Denise, was just coming off of Chappaquiddick, where he'd been criticized for not bringing Ted Kennedy to justice. And there's a chapter in the book that is dedicated to Chappaquiddick. That was going to be a couple of paragraphs, but I was really startled when I looked at all of the grand jury testimony at how Senator Kennedy really got away with manslaughter in this case. And what that tells me is that young women were disposable in 1968 and 1969. Nobody really cared. They didn't have advocates fighting for them, fighting for them against a rich, wealthy, political scion like Ted Kennedy, or a young, charismatic, murderous Tony Costa.
I'm really glad that you brought up the chapter about Mary Jo Kopechne and Ted Kennedy, because it unfolds as like the way you read it. And I'm glad you said you only expected it to be a certain length and then it turned into a chapter, because when it's introduced into the story, that's how you feel as a reader, that it starts to unfold in an unexpected way, and you get a bit of history there that you don't typically get when you hear about this story, which is surprisingly refreshing for such a tragic occurrence. You know what I mean? It's refreshing to get that honesty in there. And I'm just wondering if that was intimidating or daunting to you to write about, that the Kennedys and put these truths out there.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't intimidated by it. I was angry. I was angry that, growing up on Cape Cod in an Irish Catholic household, obviously, my family adored, the Kennedys as so many others did. And, I think, a lot of people overlooked Chappaquiddick. Certainly they did. And Kennedy got away with, again, at least manslaughter, because Mary Jo Kopechne, remained alive. She didn't drown. She died from asphyxiation. So she was alive in that Oldsmobile for, several hours while Kennedy was making his grand escape to Edgartown after the accident on the bridge at Chappaquiddick.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. That's an angering story for sure.
Yeah, and again, folding it back to, the young women in Provincetown, which is what I attempted to do. And again, realizing that these women were so disposable and nobody really cared, and it breaks your heart, having to write it and then readers reading about it, several decades later.
And have you had communication with any of the victims' families or friends of the victims?
Not friends of the victims. Well, I have actually. Christine Gallant is another woman that was, allegedly murdered by Tony Costa, not in Provincetown, but in New York City. A girlfriend of Costa's, that her death was at least initially looked at as an accidental overdose. But the medical examiner, saw bite marks on her. Costa, in the way I unfold it, murdered her. And I do believe that that's the case today. And, so one of Christine's friends has reached out and told me a little bit more about her story. With regard to, Costa's family and friends, it's interesting that, some people that are close to Costa or were close to him in 1969 still defend this monster decades later.
Yeah, that's a very confusing part. What is it about him that drew people to him?
I think his intelligence. He was a good-looking guy. He was well-read. He was charming. They had a nickname for him. He was called the Casanova Killer in the 1970s, because he was able to, break down the defenses of these young women, get them to trust him, and then murder them. And then again, why people still defend him, or at least have feelings for him today. It's beyond the pale, because I've seen the autopsy photos and the crime scene photos. I couldn't put those in the book, and I wouldn't put those in the book because they are so horrendous. I haven't seen anything this brutal since Jack the Ripper.
You write a lot about crime and disturbing moments in crime, including the poster behind you, Hunting Whitey, about Whitey Bulger, who was also very brutal. You were talking about the autopsy photos and the condition of the body and bite marks. And in your opinion, with the work that you've done, what does it take? What is it that drives somebody to be that vicious to another human being?
I think, Tony Costa hated women, and I think it all went back to his love-hate relationship with his mother. Once he felt like he had not gotten her full attention or 100% of her love, something in him snapped. And clearly it's shown with the way that he looked at these women, not as human beings, but as almost pieces of wood that he could cut up and stack without any feeling. And, there was obviously some really other, disturbing moments in the book as well, that touch on necrophilia. Costa trying to dominate these women before and after death. It's a really disturbing psychological journey that Costa had, and I think he had to detach himself from the brutality by creating this alter ego. Costa didn't look at himself as this monster. He looked at himself as what he called a free thinker in the age of Aquarius.
Right. Yeah, and I guess tell us a little bit more about his alter ego, if you can. Sometimes that kind of thing from a killer makes me think they're just full of shit. But in Costa's case, do you think this was real? He actually psychologically detached and didn't see himself as the killer?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you, Tim, in terms of you have to figure out, okay, is this a smokescreen? Is this just a shield that Costa is putting up? But I do think there were elements of detachment, reading his manuscript. That's really where I kind of got into Costa's brain a little bit, and I could see the detachment. The alter ego, Corey Devereaux, he was a real kid. He was a minor drug dealer in Provincetown at the time, somebody that Costa competed against in the drug market because Costa was a low-level drug dealer, and that's a lot of the ways and reasons why young people gravitated toward him because he had product and he had the stash and he had pills he was the Pied Piper for a lot of these kids.
In your dialogue in this book is extraordinary. It stands out as being very genuine. You can hear them speaking. And if you're familiar with the area, you can hear like their inflections and their accents in your dialogue. And it's so specific. What was your research like when going into that? How did you get such specificity?
Sure. Well, with Tony Costa, I had access to 12 hours of audio taped interviews. So I could get his inflection. I could hear how he answered questions from his attorneys. Same thing with Norman and Kurt Vonnegut. Going back to all of their interviews that they've done over the course of 30 years and understanding their mindset and reading everything about Vonnegut and Mailer that I could get my hands on. A lot of biographies, obviously all of their collective works, and understanding the fine line that both of them had, because Vonnegut is at a place in his life where he is finally confronting the horrors of World War II. He was a prisoner of war in Dresden. That story became fictionalized in Slaughterhouse-Five, but he never certainly shared any of that with his family or friends or his wife prior to that. It had to come out on the page, and he thought he had left that darkness behind in Germany, and then young women start to get murdered in his backyard. And I think, Mailer is opposite. Mailer always touched the burning candle. He always looked at the darkness within himself and was embracing that in many ways. What readers don't understand, and what I, write about Mailer in the book is, here's a guy that probably shouldn't have been outside of a prison in 1969 because Norman Mailer stabbed his second wife, Adele, nearly to death in the early 1960s, and he was never formally charged or prosecuted for it because she wouldn't testify against him. So here's Norman was a brilliant, brilliant guy, but there was a lot of darkness to him, and I think that's what drew him to Tony Costa.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. You mentioned Costa's disciples. Now, I understand that you canceled an event. Was that because of his, I guess, disciples who are still around?
Yeah, I never canceled the event. I certainly wouldn't cower to any outside, pressure or influences. But bookseller in Provincetown last year, felt pressured and had to cancel an event because people, that claimed to be friends of Tony Costa had threatened the bookseller. They were going to break windows in his bookshop if he sold Helltown. Helltown was the biggest selling crime story in Provincetown and all over New England last summer. So I felt bad for the bookseller because he was losing profits and book sales. So one day last summer he reached out to me, and he had despite the protests, he had purchased I think 5 boxes of Helltown hardcovers, and my brother and I went to Provincetown that day and we signed it. As I said, I wasn't going to, cower to the mob, this online mob that took a lot of, terror tactics against this poor bookseller. But as I said, it goes back to why would people want to defend, this monster 40 years after the crime? It really shocks me.
I guess like one natural question that comes up when you're speaking about the people who defend him, like who else have they caught? Like who else were they looking at? Who else would have been responsible for these crimes? Like
that's actually a really good question, Lance. I think that looking at the way that these murders unfolded and how Costa killed these women and was able to get away, I don't think he acted alone. I think he had help, much like, Manson was directing the scenes and, he wasn't really an active participant. I think Costa did the killing, but I think in terms of burying the bodies and covering his tracks, at least initially, he had to have had help. And I do think that there are people still around today that are concerned about that.
Like there are other accomplices that are still active?
I would say that there are people out there that probably helped him back in 1968, 1969, and they don't want to be confronted with that dark history because there is no statute of limitation on murder.
Wow. Yeah, that's wild. Geez, could that ever be proven, or is that something like that has any chance of coming back to them?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think that police have certainly, enough time and resources to focus on something like this.
Right. But there are other unsolved cases too that could potentially lead
Sure.
to someone.
Well, yeah, there are unsolved cases not only on on Cape Cod, New York City, San Francisco. Another woman, went missing. Out there that has all the earmarks of a Tony Costa murder. But, that's for the cold case squads to track down. But, a lot of times that, it's difficult enough to solve a murder that happened, 72 hours ago. Now you've got to go back over 50 years. And I don't think that there's an appetite to do it. But, that's why, a lot of the information that I reveal in the book, we can, have a court of public opinion now.
And the book raises the awareness for these crimes and for the victims. And I think the next natural question is there any adaptation that's going to be taken from this?
Yeah. So I'm very lucky when I had the idea for the book, you write a book treatment for your literary agent and then you share that with your Hollywood agent. So when I wrote the book treatment, it was about a 70-page treatment. I sent that to my managers out at Gotham Group in Hollywood, and it became a feeding frenzy. Everybody wanted it. So I was going, through Zoom calls with some of the top people in Hollywood, and finally I landed on a call with Robert and Susan Downey from Team Downey, and they had just such an amazing take on the story that was very, similar to what I was doing. And I decided to partner with Team Downey right there. Team Downey, if you don't know, they also produce Perry Mason for HBO. And I created a partnership with the Downeys and their team. And over the course of writing the book, I would send them pages as I would be sending pages to my literary agent. And we had to put a team together to take this out to market. So, they leaned in on a protagonist, not necessarily Tony Costa, but Kurt Vonnegut. And we were able to get Oscar Isaac to commit to playing Kurt Vonnegut in the limited series, which is amazing. And he's, an incredible talent. Equal to that, we got a director, a German director who was working or finalizing All Quiet on the Western Front, when we engaged with him, Edward Berger, and has since won 4 Oscars. So he is directing our project. And we've got a great showrunner who worked on Severance for Apple TV. And we have a commitment from Amazon Studio to make this limited series. So we're really excited to move into that realm once the WGA strike resolves itself, knock on wood.
Wow, that's a really exciting project. Yeah, I can't wait to see that.
Well done.
Yeah, it's an embarrassment of talent that you surround yourself with on a project like this, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, and having someone like Oscar Isaac with that star power that he has in that prominent role will draw people to it, and then they'll learn about the things that you want them to learn about, which is how those women were treated back then, and through his performance that'll come through. So just a round of applause for you on securing all of that, because you don't want the story to get lost. So do whatever you have to do to make sure that people watch and read and actually comprehend what you're trying to tell. And you got to do that through talented people.
Yeah, you do. And, you provide the introduction to the story and let the readers or the viewers kind of go from there. They'll go back and they'll research or take a look at either my book or do their own research on Tony Costa. They'll also hopefully go back and look at the careers of Kurt Vonnegut and Norman Mailer. And that's been one of the, the byproducts of the success of Helltown. There are a lot of readers out there that don't know who these guys were. So, and I've had people come up to me at signings or events that, where they have their softback copy of Slaughterhouse-Five or Tough Guys Don't Dance from Norman Mailer. And it's great because, you provide that introduction to other writers and, allow people to explore from there.
And what other books have you been working on?
Yeah, so I've got a book coming out early next year called Murder in Hollywood. Now, I've always been a big fan of Chinatown, big fan of LA Confidential. So, I talked with my literary agent and I said, I'd like to focus on something, outside of New England. And we landed on the sensational murder of Johnny Stompanato in 1958 in Hollywood, allegedly at the hands of Lana Turner's 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane. This was a sensational murder in 1958, sent shockwaves not only through Hollywood, but across the world. And I started to take a close look at this case. And it's a much bigger, more sophisticated story than has ever been out there before. Lana Turner, who was really Marilyn Monroe before Marilyn, she's been called a femme fatale and almost looked at like as a villain in Hollywood history. But I've determined and learned that she's a feminist icon. She's a pioneer to the Me Too movement that we see today. Here's a woman that was brutalized by the Hollywood system and then was brutalized by the most terrifying mobsters in Hollywood, led by Mickey Cohen. And how she turns the tables on everybody is really awe-inspiring. So I can't wait for everybody to read that book.
How did you discover this story?
I've always known about it, and but talking to my agent and finding out, okay, well, again, I have to go back to my research lab and see if there's a story to be told there. And once I started to go down that path and look at the inquest from 1958, all of the subsequent articles, all the FBI case files, from those times, I was able to really uncover a much bigger story, and a story that is so relevant even to this day.
When that's ready, let us know.
I will, definitely.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Casey, for spending some time with us here today. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate it, guys. Always a pleasure. Lance and Tim, this is a great show. Keep up the good work, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.